My name, for all intents and purposes here, is Chi, and as was said, I'm the author of the Codeless Code. So what is the Codeless Code? Some of you may be wondering. Well, it's a website that I do. I'm primarily a software developer, like most of you here. I'm also a teacher, but in my spare time, I'm a writer. And one of the things that I've come up with is this weird little project called the Codeless Code, where I, every week, pick some topic in software development, like multi-threading or refactoring or something along those lines, and I write about it in the form of a fable. Takes place in a mythical Far Eastern setting, and it involves a temple full of software developing monks and their masters. And this is sort of how I try and make some of the lessons that I've learned over the years a little bit more interesting, a little bit more palatable for people. So let me just actually move on here. And yes, so you guys said hello, so hello again. To give you all an idea of what the Codeless Code is, I am going to read the latest one that I've written, the latest installment, which I've written specifically for this conference. Again, just to give you a little flavor. One day, the temple awoke to discover that its databases had been hacked. The intrusion was traced to a web application that had recently been updated by a certain monk. The monk was fetched by 2 temple guards to explain himself to the abbess. As the miserable monk was marched up the tower stairs to see the abbess, they passed old Master Bonzen on the landing. Taking pity on the boy, the master whispered in the monk's ear, "If you speak in your own defense, the abbess will think you a coward and cut off your head. But if you do not speak in your own defense, she will believe that you were responsible for the incident and cut off your head." With those words, Bonzen departed down the stairs. I'm going to stop here before going on with the rest of this story and ask a question. Why are we here? Well, most of us are here because we're developers. Why did we become developers? We became developers, for the most part, because we like to make things. We like to make things with code. We love to code. I know that, speaking for myself, even on the weekends when I'm not at my job, I love coding. It's awesome. I've been doing it for 30 some odd years. I'm still not tired of it. I bet the same is going to be true of some of you. We love to code. And if that's all our life was, just writing the code that we find fun, writing the code that we find interesting, life would be great. You know, we get paid to code. So what's the problem? Why aren't some of us happier at our jobs? Well, because where there's code, there are people. And those people sometimes make our lives a little bit more difficult. There are different kinds of people that we have to interact with as a course of being software developers. They can be members of our own team. They can be junior developers we're mentoring. And they can also be our bosses. And they can also be irate users of our system. And sooner or later, we have to know how to interact with them and talk tech with them. So the kinds of people that hopefully we'll be talking tech with are other techies, but even still, they might not see eye to eye. For example, they might be senior developers who have joined our project and they're working on the same enterprise system that we're working on. They want to go off on a tear and they want to do something. And we know that's not a safe thing to do. I need to explain to you why you can't go off and do that. They may be developers who are out there in the web and we want them to use some third-party software, open source software that we've written and uploaded to GitHub. We want to interest them in our software. And when they're using our software and they have questions, we want to be able to answer their questions. The other kinds of people that we might be talking tech with are junior developers that we're mentoring. And these junior developers have not come up to speed as far as we have. And we have to be able to explain things to them like why you should write unit tests, why sanitizing your input is a really good idea. Now, you tell junior developers that sanitizing their input is a good idea, and you can even show them how to do it. And maybe even you have the authority to tell them to do it, but if you don't convince them, if you don't make the case clear to the point where they believe you and want to do it, well, they're probably not going to go out of their way to do it, right? Because we're all busy. And it's like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to write unit tests. I don't want to worry about my input. My application seems to work. And you're probably, if you're mentoring them, way too busy to take a look at every single line of code they've written and make sure they're doing their job 100% correctly. And if you don't, and if they have introduced bugs into your system, and those bugs are security bugs, then there's a whole other category of people that you're going to have to start talking tech with. And that category of people is a little bit more difficult. People who don't understand technology. Your bosses in the future may be individuals that primarily came from some other sphere, like management, like business. They may not be technology people, and you're going to have to tell your bosses why it is you need twice the amount of time you thought you needed to deliver an application so that you can do code reviews because of these junior developers that just created a problem. And then you're going to have to tell your customers that, oh, it looks like our application was hacked last night because one of my junior developers didn't sanitize their inputs. And you're going to have to tell your end users what of their personal information might have been compromised and what they should do to protect themselves and how you're going to ensure that this kind of a breach does not happen in the future. And if you're not good at all of these explanations, if you're not really good at laying out exactly what happened and why it wasn't really your fault, you may need to be talking to a technical recruiter about your next position. And none of us really want that. So on that note, let's revisit our friend the monk. The monk was called into the office of the abbess, who unsheathed a sword and said, "Explain how you brought disgrace to our temple." The monk began to profess his innocence, but remembering the advice of Master Bonzen, he quickly shut his mouth, lest the abbess behead him for cowardice. Yet the silence that followed only made the abbess resolute in her anger. She raised her sword and approached the terrified boy, determined to behead him for his undisputed incompetence. In desperation, the monk's eyes searched the room for another exit, but they found only a screen of rice paper and bamboo, beyond which lay a narrow balcony and a 100-foot plummet to the rocks below. As the whistling blade fell toward his neck, the monk was enlightened. The monk dove under the abbess's blade, rolled across the room, and stood before the rice paper screen. Taking a red marker from his robe, he hastily drew a stick figure in one panel. The abbess paused, intrigued. In the next panel, and in each one following, the monk drew shaky cartoons depicting the events that had occurred over the past few weeks, and how his clan had reacted to each. When taken individually, no step was an error. Yet when taken collectively, it was clear that a confluence of unrelated actions had resulted in the critical vulnerability. The abbess sheathed her sword, and with a wave of her hand, dismissed the monk. But when the monk reached her doorway, the abbess gave him a swift kick in the behind, sending him tumbling down the long tower stairs. "That," said the abbess, "is for writing on my walls." We are often in this field at the mercy of people who do not understand technology. And it's very frustrating sometimes to deal with them. It's very, very frustrating. Happens to me all the time. I'm trying to get some point across to someone. It's critical. I want authorization to do something. I'm trying to convince somebody, just let me do something. And they don't understand what I want to do. And I say, no. And it's perhaps one of the most difficult things to deal with as a technologist, to amass all this information and not have people trust you, but we always have to remember something. We didn't start out knowing technology. You didn't start out knowing how to code. You didn't come out of the womb that way. Somebody taught you. Even if you taught yourself, even if you said, I went to all these websites, I read all this documentation, I taught myself how to code. Somebody wrote that documentation. Somebody wrote those pages that you read. Someone helped you understand. They taught you. Teaching is how we move forward. Teaching is how civilization moves forward. And teaching has never been as important, in my opinion, than at this time and in our profession. Now, why do I say that? IT is a world that's constantly in motion. Every year there's some new language or new paradigm or new toolkit that we as developers are going to have to learn if we are to stay current, if we are to keep up with the times. But there's a bit of a vicious circle that we expose ourselves to. We are paid to make the world go faster, right? That's what technology is all about, making things happen faster and easier. And we also have to keep up with everything that's happening around us, all the other changes in the world that people are doing, the changes to the protocols that we're using, the changes to the systems we have to interface with. We have to keep up with that too. So here we are, making our little corner of the world run faster, and we're keeping up with other people who are making their little corner of the world run faster. And all these new things eventually cease to be new and become the norm. So now the faster world is the norm, which makes way for an even newer new, an even faster fast tomorrow. So the world spins faster and faster and faster with each passing year, with each passing decade. And we find ourselves, as developers, with less and less time to keep up. We have barely enough time to learn the intricacies of our own complex systems and the systems that we inherit, much less keep up with all the other stuff that's happening around us. This is how little mistakes turn into problems. And when you consider that our cars and our planes and our medical systems and our militaries are all running increasingly on software, those problems can be big problems. The only thing that keeps everything together, that keeps the whole system, this whole complex web of interconnected software from crashing down around our ears, is the knowledge of how things work at the small level, at the big level. Knowledge conveyed from people to other people. What holds the world together? Knowing and being able to teach. People who know and people like you who can teach other people to know, to understand. Okay? So teaching is important. How do we teach well? Well, teaching effectively means that the people we're teaching need to learn. Otherwise, we're not teaching, we're just talking. Okay, how do we get people to learn? Well, we want to keep them interested. We want to keep them engaged. How do we do that? Well, by finding interesting and engaging ways of teaching our subject matter. Now, there are a number of different strategies that we can use for teaching effectively. There's a particular one that I want to focus on, and that's art. What is art? Art is the ability of human beings to communicate with other human beings in ways other than words. We communicate through song, we communicate through pictures, we communicate even through words, through stories as well. Art is about communication. We've spent much of the history of humankind refining ways of communicating with other people, embodied by the various different arts. We have spent thousands of years of figuring out how to communicate, how to teach. Art is about taking something that we understand, something we know, something we remember, and putting it into a form that will be digested into another person's brain to have an effect. The goddesses of the arts and sciences in Greek mythology, the Muses, were the daughters of Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. I don't believe that that is just an arbitrary choice. Art is about taking the things we remember and turning them into things that will be remembered by someone else. Art is about hacking the mind. What is this? Music? No. This is just notes on a piece of paper or on a screen. In order for it to become music, something has to happen to it. Someone, usually a musician, has to read this, turn it into sounds. Someone has to compile it. This is source code. What you're looking at is source code. Well, if it's compiled by a musician, what's the machine that runs it? The brain, right? Specifically the mind that hears the sounds and the mind that turns the sounds into music and then turns the music into a call to action. And that can be either a desire to clap your hands to the beat, or to get up and dance, or to sing along at the chorus, or to write songs of your own. Art, music, all of the arts, they're entertainment, but they can also be calls to action. Again, art is about hacking the mind. It's about getting people to learn things, even when they don't think they're being taught. It's about getting people inspired to do things, even when they don't think they're being convinced. Those of you who are developers, you spent your entire lives as developers learning the specifics of machines so that you can take your knowledge of how a machine works and make code that will make that machine do something for you. Art is about hacking the mind, and we're all hackers. So let's hack. There is a very old form of speaking and writing known as rhetoric, developed by the Greeks and Romans. It is the art of persuasive speaking and writing. There are several different principles of rhetoric. First principle is coming up with your argument, the thing that you want to convince someone else of. This might be, for example, I want you to use this jQuery plugin I've written. Or, I want you to write unit tests. Or, I want you to sanitize your input. This is coming up with your argument, your reasons why, and then ordering your points in a specific way. It's a journey of the mind. That's what rhetoric is conducting people on a journey of the mind. Point A, the starting point of that journey, is where the audience is right now. I don't know what sanitizing inputs is. I don't really care. You want to take them from there effortlessly to point Z. Oh my God, I just realized that I exposed us to a SQL injection bug. Let me fix that right now. Journey of the mind. Okay? It turns out that in the grand sphere of art forms, there is a perfect art form out there for conducting people on a journey of the mind. And that art form is stories. Now, I'm not talking user stories here. I'm talking stories. Talking about plays, I'm talking about movies, I'm talking about books, I'm talking about poetry, even sometimes anything that conveys a story of something happening. Stories are universal. We love stories. People love to hear stories. We listen to them as kids. If you can figure out how to get over perhaps whatever stage fright you might have and learn how to tell stories, you can explain anything to anyone. Right? So, we want to tell good stories. How is that done? What are the ingredients? Some of you may have recently read a novel, seen a movie. Something happened before you did. It was so subtle you probably didn't realize it was happening, but it happened anyway. It had to have. You decided to read the novel. You decided to watch the movie. What made you decide? What made you end up with that book in your hand? What made you end up in that seat in the audience? Well, you saw something. Something that told you about the book. Something that told you about the film. You saw a teaser, for example, for the movie while you were watching perhaps another movie. You saw the cover artwork on the novel, or you saw a blurb on the back that described it. You said, aha, that's the novel for me. And you bought it. You sat in that movie theater. Teasers are very, very important. There are a lot of media choices out there. There are a lot of links to click on, movies to watch, books to read. We can't do all of them. The idea is you have to get somebody to attend your lecture, to read your book or your paper or your website. And in order to do that, you have to make it attractive from the outside. Now, I'm not talking about clickbait. I want to be very, very clear about that. The thing that defines clickbait is that you click on something that looks interesting and you get there and you find out it's not really that interesting, it was just sold to you. I'm talking about taking the essence of whatever it is you're trying to communicate technologically speaking, distilling it down and making that essence as exciting as possible in as few words as possible. Now, there's another art form that is responsible for giving people information and making them want to read that information in as few words as possible, trying to give them an overview, give them a teaser, an enticement. Journalism. Journalism uses a principle called the upside-down pyramid. Anybody ever heard of this? Upside-down pyramid? The upside-down pyramid in journalism looks like this. This is how a typical article is organized in a newspaper. And this is an art form. By the way, journalism is the art of telling true stories. Below the headline, you have a paragraph, usually called the lead paragraph, that has your critical facts in it. It's your most important stuff. Under the critical facts, exposition of the details, detail, getting more and more low level, less and less important, until we reach the end where there's some fluff. Typical article in a newspaper. But notice what's above the critical facts. What's the thing on top of the article? Is the headline. The headline that gets you to read the article in the first place. The headline that tells you, in a couple of words, something really exciting has just happened. That's what you need to find within the story that you want to tell somebody else. You need to make it a story that they want to hear. Now, let's say I were to tell you, let's say I'm in the process of trying to come up with a way of responding to a security breach at my company. I could have a talk that I send out to everybody, proper use of the JDBC Prepared Statement API. And if I distribute my invitation with that title, I can expect roughly 0 people to attend, including me, because boy, does that sound boring. But if I say how we were hacked last night and what we're going to do about it, same story, same talk, feels a little different though. After we've got people attending our talk, the first thing that they're going to want to know when they sit down and we start flapping our gills is, what is this talk about and why should I care? Now, in traditional stories in fiction, which will be our guiding model for this journey of the mind, the way fiction does it is by introducing a setting and characters. Get the audience oriented. Let them know where they are and give them someone or something to care about as quickly as possible. One of the science fiction novels that I've loved for a very long time is Stanislaw Lem's Siberiad. Anybody here read that? Good, excellent. Okay, I've read an English translation, obviously. The English translation starts like this. One day, Turl the constructor invented a machine that could create anything starting with the letter N. That's a great opening line. I mean, we have a setting, one day, okay, it's a little vague. We have 2 characters already, Turl and the machine that can create anything that begins with the letter N. And already there's something interesting going on. The machine creates anything that can begin with the letter N. Wow, that's kind of neat. Right away, we might be a little bit intrigued. As the story goes on, we learn more about Turl. He makes things, and he makes mistakes, like us. So we can empathize with him, we can identify with him. We begin to care about what happens to him, because we like him, because we're curious, because we want to know, what's going on with this machine that can create anything with a letter N. You can do this same trick, you can use the same exact trick with a technology talk. It seems a little bit weird, but you actually can. Your characters may be the people you're talking to, or the people you're talking about, like the folks in operations. Okay, those might be the people that you're talking about. Those might be your characters. Or you, the audience. Or the characters may even be the software modules you're talking about. So you've created this wonderful jQuery plugin. You've created this wonderful GitHub project. That's the thing that you're going to talk about. That's your main character. You can even anthropomorphize that character. Make that character, even if that character is not a human being, give that character human attributes. Because our software is pretty complex these days, and it does complex things just like people do, right? Software sends emails, creates reports, and makes mistakes like us. So for example, if I were explaining to one of my customers that my application freaks out when it sees UTF-8 input, my customer might not know what that means from a technology standpoint, but by saying my application freaks out, I've given them a very, very vivid mental image, and I've made my application help me with that mental image by playing the part of a character who's freaking out. And now, my customer knows UTF-8 input. I don't know what that is, but it sounds like it's really bad for this application. It's a little trick. Now, characters will only sustain most stories for so long. The next thing that fiction usually does is introduce a source of conflict. Now, in our case, in technology, the source of conflict is most likely going to be a problem that needs to be overcome. Most of the time we're writing software to do something, to solve a problem. If we're trying to tell people about sanitizing inputs, the problem that we're dealing with is the fact that we're facing a world full of people that are trying to break into our systems. Okay? Well, in fiction, we generally have conflict as well. Conflict makes things interesting. There are 4 types of conflict that you'll normally hear about. Person against person, person against society, person against nature, person against themselves. Maybe some of you have heard that. So when you're dealing with your technical talk, think about how you can reframe it so that there is up front a source of conflict. Okay, so let's say I was going to be giving a talk about operations support and tools to help me do production support for my systems. That can be a really boring slog. Or I could reframe it in the terms of person against machine. It's 3 a.m. and you're all alone and you get a call. Our servers are crashing. What tools are going to help you figure out why they're crashing? Wow. Suddenly you might be interested, right? That's me there. That's me dealing with that conflict. I can see that happening. What tools are out there? What are they going to help you find? When you get that information, what tools are you going to run next? I could probably interest you in some really cool GitHub project that I've created to plow through log files, if I frame through it that way. Instead of starting a talk with, okay, well, this utility helps you parse log files from syslog-d, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Conflict. It's prevalent everywhere. It's everywhere that we are. We're solving problems all the time. Now, conflict usually means that if you don't solve the problem, there are consequences. Otherwise, the conflict is not really that interesting, right? Okay, so I'll give you another example from fiction. Let's say I were to tell you that a woman has decided to rob her employer. What's at stake? Well, she gets money if she succeeds, jail time if she doesn't, right? Yeah, not that interesting a story. But what if I told you that the reason she decided to rob her employer was this? Her husband's dying of cancer, and she doesn't have money for cancer treatments, so she borrowed money from the mob. And now she can't pay the money back. And the mob says, okay, you can't pay the money back? Then we're going to make you help us rob the bank where you work. And just to make sure you don't go running to the police, we've abducted your kids. Now all of a sudden, there's a lot more tension, right? Suddenly the consequences are much more severe. Now that we know the consequences, the fact that she's stealing from her employer is a little bit more interesting. So when you're putting forth your information, if there's something you want your audience to do, whether it's sanitizing inputs or writing JUnit tests or hiring more people, anything, communicate to them the probable consequences, or at least risks, of not doing that action. Make sure they understand what is at stake. If you're stuck for stories, the Daily WTF is an excellent site. When I was looking for stuff for this talk, I was just curious out there, was there anything out there about sanitizing inputs? And it turns out, yes, there is. There's a story about the Department of Corrections in Oklahoma, which did not have proper development practices on its website. And they left this incredible security hole that allowed people to get in. And for a period of 3 years, the names, addresses, and social security numbers of all these Oklahoma citizens were exposed to the general public. Now, if I tell my boss, I need to take twice as much time to deliver this next release so that I can do code reviews to make sure people are sanitizing inputs, that doesn't say anything. But if I give them this story about what happened with the Oklahoma Department of Corrections and how embarrassing that was, and the lawsuits that were opened up, and say, look, this is not a theoretical, this is not a hypothetical, this is an actual, this happened. Here's the story, here's the headline, here are the companies that were involved. Don't let this be us. Carries a lot more weight. And we shouldn't exaggerate, shouldn't overemphasize things that are really, really tiny, but if there are consequences, and if you've seen what happens when people suffer those consequences, that's an excellent strategy to communicate to your people that you're talking to. But they can still say, do we really have to do anything now? People are not going to act when the action is a difficult one if they don't have to deal with it immediately. They'll postpone, they'll procrastinate, maybe it'll be someone else's problem. So one of the things that stories generally do is they create a sense of urgency. So you get your conflict, right? Conflict might be something along the lines of, I don't know, rebels versus the Empire. I'm assuming people here have seen the Star Wars Episode 4, please? Okay, good. So you've got your conflict, rebels versus the Empire, and you've got your consequences. Oh, the Empire is going to eliminate peace and freedom throughout the galaxy. Okay, well, why do we have to act on it now? The Death Star is coming, and it's going to destroy your planet. That's the thing that we got to take care of. That's the urgent thing that we have to focus on. Why this is a problem now? Why do we have to deal with the situation now? What's different about today versus yesterday? This is why fiction tries to give us situations where there is a deadline, because urgency ramps up the tension, keeps the audience interested. If Luke Skywalker could go to the Death Star anytime in the next 20 years, Luke, take your time. Not really that compelling a story. So, if we've got somebody that's going to be flying to the Death Star to blow it up, or we've got somebody that's going to take a long, long journey to Mordor to drop the ring into Mount Doom's lava and free Middle-earth from Sauron, we've got to basically say, okay, this is the good thing that's going to happen if you do that, if you take that really long journey. This is your reward. Your goal is not to actually drop the ring into Mount Doom. Your goal is to vanquish the Dark Lord. and the reward for doing that is all sorts of wonderful things, peace and freedom from Mordor technical support calls, no more tech support from Mordor, yay, and puppies and ice cream and whatever other good things you can think of. So if you're presenting a difficult course of action for your customer, if you're basically taking them on a long path to a technology upgrade, to a refactoring, you got to at least tell them the good thing that's going to come out the other end. Saying that, well, it's best development practices is not going to fly. Saying, well, we should do that because that's what industry is doing is generally not going to fly. Show them what good thing will come out of the expense of effort, or money, or time, or resources. What are the rewards? Because if you don't, this is the reaction you're going to get. And even if you do, this may still be the reaction you get. People may be convinced of your argument. They may be convinced that you have to act now, but they may not be convinced of the thing you have to do, the technological path that you are proposing that your customer or your manager or your end user go down. So, if you get a reaction like this, what you have to do is address all of the different possibilities that the users of your open source software might have as alternatives to your open source software module. You might have to address all these other options out there and say why yours is actually the one that they should be using under perhaps a certain set of circumstances, or even just in general. If you're taking your audience on a mental journey from A to Z, yeah, you've got to hit B, C, and D, but you also have to hit B1 and C2 and show them why those are dead ends. We can't do it that way. Now, you may even agree, I would really love to do it that way, but it's not possible. It's just not feasible. Now, there is a normal human reluctance to point out the flaws in our own arguments. You may recognize problems in what you're proposing, in your technical solution. You may recognize risks, weaknesses, and you will have an understandable reluctance to bring those up to the people you are talking to. Fight that urge. That urge is not actually serving you well. It is warning you that you may not have a solid argument. If you can't lead somebody from A to Z without going through X, and X is really, really hard, don't just skip over mentioning X. You have to find a way through X. You have to bring X up and say, well, here's a risk and here's how we're going to mitigate it. Probably heard that language before. Why do I say that? Why do you have to do that? Why do you have to expose the weaknesses in your own plan? Well, let me put it to you this way. Have you ever watched a movie that had a really, really saccharine, happy ending where all sorts of things just magically worked out, and you sat there and you went, huh, and you just didn't feel the gladness in your heart? You felt that something was off somehow. You felt cheated. Oh, look, something happened and magically they got what they wanted. Hooray. The reason stories like that don't work is because life doesn't really work that way. Have you ever maybe seen this expression? At some level, we all know this. At some level, we all know that life is constantly throwing us curveballs. Well-structured fiction, fiction that gets inside the heads of people and makes them feel satisfied, that makes for a satisfying mental journey, well-structured fiction, is all about throwing obstacles in the paths of the characters and then watching the characters overcome those obstacles through their own skills and knowledge. That's what's satisfying. And when they maybe shift their goals, it's like, okay, now I gotta, in order to get around X, I gotta hit W. Okay, I'm gonna throw another obstacle in your way. And now you gotta go over here, you gotta go to Y. I'm taking the long way around, but I'll finally hit Z. Fiction is structured that way. That's part of hacking the brain of the reader. You don't have things magically work out. That's not a happy ending to a story. That's wish fulfillment. Don't give your customers, your bosses, the happy, 100% guaranteed wish fulfillment story of whatever technical thing you're proposing, because at some inner psychological level, they're not going to believe you. They're going to think you are selling something to them. And the worst thing happens is if you get caught out, you might find yourself in a situation like this. No one wants to be the person that's put in months of effort only to find out, oh gee, if only somebody had mentioned the Eagles. All right, so let's take a little bit of a step back. Fiction has given us the skeleton of a mental journey that we can take people on. Teasers to get people in the room to our lecture, to get people to read our website, to get people to take a look at our GitHub project, setting a characters thing that we introduce, get them to care about it. Why should I care? What's in it for me? Conflict, what problem are we trying to solve? Is it a problem that I care about? Ooh, it is. I'm interested, I'm gonna keep reading. What are the consequences? Oh wow, you're really serious. I'm gonna keep reading. I better do this thing. Urgency, oh wow, I better do this thing now. Goals and rewards, puppies and ice cream. Cover the dead ends, gotta do this, can't do that. And then you can expand on your argument. Okay, that's fine. That's the skeleton of a journey. You can present a tech talk that way. Present a TED talk that way. You can convince your customer of why you need to upgrade your software that way. You can talk about your open source project that way. Is there anything else that we can do? Keep our audience interested? Because that's a long journey. Well, the codeless code makes use of a particular storytelling technique called analogies, simile, metaphor. Analogies are a way of overcoming the situation where we are talking to somebody who does not have our background. How do you explain the unfamiliar? You explain it in terms of the familiar. You give somebody something that's like, well, this is just like that. And the codeless code, for any of you that ever chance to see the site, the analogies are pretty ridiculous, but there's a reason behind that. I'll give you an example, which this case is actually illustrating. I was thinking about refactoring and trying to convince my customer that I needed some time to refactor our systems. And they're saying, well, you know, why don't you just keep writing code? It's this refactoring thing. Why are you tearing code down? So I said, well, it's sort of like a house. So you start off, you've got a little tiny house, and then, you know, you get married, now you and your spouse are in the house, and then you have some kids maybe, and now the kids are in the house, and so what do? Well, I don't want to move to another house. That's too much effort. I'm just going to tack a room on here, and a room on there, and another room here, and another room here, and on and on. And in my particular case, I had the rooms go out over a cliff. And the person was just tacking on more rooms, despite the fact that the house was swaying in the slightest breeze. So now when I do that, I've gotten across a very, very subtle point. I've said, this house is unsafe. Now, I didn't have to actually say in words, this house is unsafe. It's obvious. It's obvious. And because I was drawing the analogy between this and refactoring the story, mentally, my audience, hopefully, will draw the conclusion, aha, adding onto a code base without refactoring constantly is also unsafe because you end up with a fragile, unstructured mess that could collapse at any moment. See, the power of a well-chosen analogy, if you can find it, is your audience's brain is doing the hard work for you. And this is another mental hack. This is the reason I believe the Socratic method works the way it is. You get your student to come to the correct conclusion without you explicitly saying, this is the conclusion you should come to. Because when a person works that out for themselves, it's much more powerful. If you, for example, believe in unit tests or test-driven development through bitter experience, you want that bitter experience to be translated in some way to the person that you are mentoring. You want them to have that lifetime of experience compressed right into a very, very short amount of time. And the way to do that is get them to actually walk the walk that you have walked, okay? Remember in the Matrix, Morpheus says there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. You have to get your audience to walk the path, to go on the mental journey, not to just tell them the right answer, get them to see the right answer for themselves. Analogy is a very, very powerful tool for that, because through analogy, people do go, aha, I get it, I see it, I understand it, X is like Y, got it. And they've gone down the path. You've taken them on the mental journey. You've succeeded. You've transferred your experience to another human being without them having to go through all the hard part. If your talk is long, like mine is right now, another way to deal with it is to break it up into subtopics. And those of you who were at Dan's opening today saw that it was divided into 3 separate parts. I thought it was excellent. I'll bring him into this now. Divide your story up into smaller stories in order to keep the motion going. And when you do so, remember that those smaller stories should have much of the same structure as the larger story. This is the reason a novel is divided into chapters. This is the reason a film is divided into scenes. It makes it more chunkable. It makes it more accessible, digestible for the audience to break things up into little pieces. Aha, that's the scene where this thing happens. That's the lightsaber fight. You know, that's the whatever. Break it up into scenes. Now, we have to put those scenes in some kind of order. We might think, we can put them in any old order we want. But the order that we care about, that will work best, is one in which the action builds and falls off. Some of you may have seen this. This is a 3-act structure, the standard 3-act structure for fiction. You'll notice that there's a rising and a falling of energy. You'll notice it's made up of little rising and fallings of energy. Your talk should have a similar energy. If you're a speaker, you should be doing that too. You should have little rises and falls. You should have periods where you're excited, where you're talking about things like urgency, and periods that are a little bit more reflective, a little bit more sedate. Peaks and troughs. There's a rhythm to it. Long-form stories should have a rhythm. One of the ways that you can keep audience members interested is also through suspense. Don't give them everything up front. Remember I said that there's a problem with the inverted pyramid, the upside-down pyramid. It's really decent for a lot of things, but there's one small problem with it. And the problem with the upside-down pyramid is it doesn't leave any suspense. It gives you all the facts right up front. So in your storytelling, you might want to leave a little bit of something unresolved early on. Not a major thing, but enough to keep the audience, all right, hang on, I want to find out what he was talking about with that. And of course, another way to keep the audience interested is comic relief. Comedy is difficult, humor is difficult. You have to be sensitive to your audience, you have to know your audience, but if you can actually find ways of bridging the gap between you and them through humor, it's excellent because humor breaks down social barriers between employer and employee, between teacher and student, between customer and contractor. When we laugh together, when we share a joke, it equalizes us, humanizes us, and that actually helps the audience identify with you as a teacher. It helps them think, okay, maybe this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Don't be afraid to take yourself a little less seriously. This guy wasn't, and he's known for being pretty smart. Now, I would absolutely love to ramble on and on and on. My last principle that I want to get into is brevity. Brevity, what can I say? The less you talk, the less you say, the easier it is for people to consume it and keep it inside. We live in the age of the soundbite, the age of the 6-second video on Vine. If you want to get inside your audience's head, be as small as possible. If you think that cutting yourself to a shorter form, cutting your stories down to the bone, is not going to allow you to tell those stories, I will tell you that in fiction, there's actually an art form called 6-word stories. Here is a 6-word science fiction story. You can chew on that. It actually sets up a character, a conflict. It poses all sorts of existential questions in 6 words. So, I believe we're running extremely short on time, if not completely out. I see that as a 5. Has that 5 turned into a 0? It's 0. Okay. I have a lot of other things I would love to say, and I'm totally happy to continue rambling on and on about this stuff, music and poetry, visual arts, whatever. But I would just like to say in closing, if I could ask any of you to do just one thing, is to try and be teachers. Everybody in IT has valuable experiences, unique perspectives, hard-won wisdom. Share that wisdom with other people. Learn a way to tell your stories. Find a way that is as effective, as entertaining as possible. Because when you teach, when you connect yourself to other people, when you spread understanding, the world becomes that much saner a place. And we become a lot closer together, and really the world could use a lot more of that. So thank you all very, very much.